Sí,
Bueno,
sí.
muy bien, muchas gracias. Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Yo les agradezco a todos, a todas que están, bueno, que han venido. Muchísima gente respondió a nuestro llamado. Así que les agradezco mucho. Es el segundo de estos diálogos DMD de reflexiones críticas sobre el vivir y el morir. Bueno, está organizado por la Asociación Civil por el Derecho a Morir con Dignidad. Bueno, en esta ocasión tenemos un panel que les va a resultar muy fascinante y sobre todo, creo yo, muy estimulante. Nos va a dejar con muchas preguntas, con muchas cuestiones y nos va a faltar tiempo, sin duda, para todas las preguntas que va a haber. Y además es un diálogo a distancia. Tenemos con nosotros al doctor Peter Singer en Melbourne. O sea, está al otro lado del mundo. Peter, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Bueno, sabemos lo muy ocupado que estás.
I'm
Y
very happy to be with you.
thank you, Peter. I see you again. I saw
My
you
pleasure.
la última vez te vi en Nueva York. Me da gusto verte aquí ahora. Y bueno, tenemos también a Marichuy Medina. Muchas gracias, Marichuy. Estás aquí con nosotras y bueno, es una mujer muy movida, una investigadora de la UNAM. Creo que van a ser muy buen contraste nuestros dos ponentes. Bueno, ellos, como ustedes saben, van a hablar de la eutanasia y la eutanasia es un tema, es ya muy controvertido. Es muy controvertido. Peter es muy controvertido. Sus propuestas sobre el tema son también controvertidas, pero es aún más ahora a raíz del COVID. A raíz del coronavirus, el tema de la eutanasia y el tema de la muerte ha cobrado como un protagonismo que no había tenido nunca. En México es curioso, pero celebramos a los muertos, pero nunca hablamos de la muerte. No se toca el tema de la muerte. Hay gentes de otros países que me dicen afortunados de tener el Día de Muertos porque están tan conscientes de la muerte. Y bueno, sorpresa, ¿no? En una reciente investigación que hicimos, el 70% de los mexicanos no hablan nunca de la muerte, nunca, 70%. No piensan en la muerte siquiera. La mayoría de ellos ni siquiera habla con sus doctores. Un 3% habla con sus doctores de la muerte. O sea, la muerte la vemos en las fiestas, pero nunca hablamos de ella hasta que llegó el coronavirus. El coronavirus nos ha puesto enfrente a la muerte y estamos ahora ya muy conscientes porque creemos o sabemos que puede llegarnos en cualquier momento por todo lo que hemos estado viendo todos los días en los medios. Y es curioso porque estaba ahí desde siempre, ¿no? Con el coronavirus, pero ahorita estamos todos los mexicanos, por lo menos posiblemente mucha gente de todas las partes del mundo está muy consciente de eso. Y también estamos muy conscientes de una situación que también estaba ahí, pero que ahorita se ha hecho pues dolorosamente presente en nuestro país, que es como la precariedad, la insuficiencia de nuestras instalaciones sanitarias. O sea, no alcanzan las camas, es muy deficiente, no hay los médicos suficientes, porque los hay muy buenos, pero no los hay suficientes y mucha gente se ha quedado sin atención o se ha vuelto a su casa. Y hay una población que tiene mucho más que ver con la eutanasia, que son los viejos y también las personas que están con enfermedades terminales o enfermedades crónicas. Es una población que tiene como una indiferencia social muy tremenda en nuestro país y siempre había estado ahí, pero ahorita se ha hecho muy presente. O sea, es una población que no tiene ni siquiera los cuidados paliativos suficientes. Nuestro seminario primero fue acerca de cuidados paliativos porque hay muchos estados de la República que no tienen unidades de cuidados paliativos. Y las que sí los tienen, a lo mejor solo tienen una y ni siquiera está equipada. O sea, hay mucha gente sufriendo que no tiene a dónde ir. Bueno, el otro tema de esta población es que están muy abandonados porque nunca nadie se atreve a hablarles de la muerte. Nosotros en DMD recabamos testimonios de personas que han estado con personas que están muriendo y la mayoría de ellos dice, nunca le contamos, estoy pensando en una persona, mi abuela que se moría, porque dijeron, no tienes que mencionar la palabra cáncer. Entonces esta señora se pasó con unos dolores horribles, muy abandonada, porque como nadie le podía hablar de la muerte, fue muy aislada, nadie se atrevía ni a acercarse a ella. Esas son dos lacras, el sistema de salud, esta cultura que no habla de la muerte, y bueno, que es algo de lo que vamos a hablar hoy, es sin el marco legal necesario para que aquellos que quieren optar por una muerte vía la eutanasia no pueden hacerlo. Y aquí, pues yo creo que, bueno, también otra situación que nos hemos encontrado es que tampoco hay los medicamentos, no hay las drogas ni los fármacos necesarios para paliar el dolor. O sea, hay muchísima gente que está muriendo con muchísimos dolores cuando sería relativamente fácil que murieran con fármacos que luego por tabús o por ignorancia o por los problemas aquí que tenemos con las drogas, no tenemos acceso a ellos. Tampoco tenemos los acompañamientos psicológicos necesarios. Bueno, ante esta situación, por el derecho a morir con dignidad, que es esta asociación que organiza estos diálogos, pues pensamos que teníamos no solo que promover que se conozca y que se sepa del derecho a tener una muerte asistida, médicamente asistida, sino también a incidir en todos estos otros situaciones dolorosas que acompañan a la vejez y a las enfermedades crónicas. Y bueno, a mí siempre me gusta como comentar esto, que cuando llegamos a la vida, y sobre todo, bueno, en México, es un festejo. Todo mundo te celebra, te hacen tu cuartito por ahí, las abuelitas te tejen chambritas, las tías también. Entonces, somos muy festejados cuando llegamos a este mundo y ni siquiera hemos hecho nada. Ya llegamos, ¿no? Y ya está, nos aplauden. Y sin embargo, hay una situación muy diferente cuando nos tenemos que despedir de este mundo. O sea, mal que bien todos hemos hecho algo, ¿no? Todo el mundo ha pasado por la vida que no es fácil, muchos han tenido unos logros muy importantes y morimos a lo mejor muy solos, indiferentes, con una sociedad que no se ocupa de nosotros. Que a mí me parece como muy paradójico. Entonces, creo que hay mucho que hacer en esta, y siento que es el tema del momento realmente, el coronavirus. Hay muchas cosas que son coyunturales, pero el derecho a tener una muerte humana me parece que es uno de los más importantes o de los más urgentes temas a abordar de esta época que estamos nosotros viviendo. O sea, bueno, algo que ocurrió en el coronavirus a mí me llamó la atención, que cuando vimos que faltaban respiradores en nuestro país y en muchas partes del mundo, pero aquí en nuestro país también, bueno, se llegó a sugerir que, o por lo menos así pasó a los medios, ya nunca sabemos, ¿no? Pero que fueran los viejos los que se quedaran los últimos para recibir el respirador. O sea, digo, bueno, eso está muy bien, pero ¿por qué si se te pide eso cuando eres viejo, por qué no también se te da el derecho a morir sin dolor, a morir cuando tú quieres, cuando ya no resistes más, vía la eutanasia o el suicidio médicamente asistido? Me parecía como que no chetaba, ¿no? Te piden que te ofrendes, pero al otro lado no te dejan morir como tú deseas. Entonces creo que es un tema el que vamos a escuchar ahorita de mucha relevancia, es un tema que apasiona, se meten muchos temas y todo el mundo tiene derecho a su opinión, pero también creo que sí tenemos derecho a nuestras opiniones, pero también tenemos la obligación de escuchar, de documentarnos, de saber qué está pasando. Y justamente la idea de estos diálogos que estamos teniendo a través de esta asociación, estos diálogos para reflexionar críticamente acerca de todos estos temas del vivir y el morir. Y bueno, me encontré unas frases que dije, bueno, esto creo que voy a parafrasear a Toni Morrison, a Saramago y a Ortega y Gasset en unas cuantas frases que me gustaron, porque creo que sintetiza la filosofía de la asociación que yo presido. Son todos revueltos, tomé un poco de cada uno y es lo que me salió ahorita como síntesis de nuestra propuesta de trabajo de nuestra misión. Morimos, bueno, este es un statement de Toni Morrison, somos para la muerte, y ese es quizá el significado de la vida. Somos para la muerte, ese es el significado de la vida, así lo pone ella, pero añade, hacemos lenguaje. Y hacer lenguaje, comunicarnos e intercambiar ideas puede ser la medida de nuestras vidas. O sea, sí vas a morir, pero haz lenguaje, ponles palabras, di tu opinión, reflexiona y pásalo. Bueno, ahí es donde yo creo que estriba la importancia de nuestros diálogos y la importancia de que cada uno de nosotros elaboremos nuestro propio lenguaje. Sí escuchemos, pero siempre me ha parecido lo más importante que tú saques tu lenguaje. Aunque todo el mundo que te critique, aunque sean tus tonterías, lo que sea, escucha y luego atrévete a decir lo que quieres. Y yo creo que ahora que nos hemos enfrentado a la muerte a través de la pandemia, creo que hay una tarea muy importante y es como fomentar el arte de morir. Porque hemos huido de la muerte como humanidad muchos, muchos años. Antes estaba la religión, ahora ya no. Entonces es el momento de elaborar, de fomentar el arte de morir como seres humanos, en medio de un ambiente en donde el ser humano pueda dar lo mejor de sí mismo. Y ya después que creamos eso, bueno, hacer lo necesario para vivir de acuerdo a esa propuesta. Bueno, esto es en síntesis lo que son estos diálogos, lo que es DMD, y bueno, agradezco de nuevo a Peter, a Marichuy que estén con nosotros, y bueno, Cristina, te toca empezar a ti. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Amparo. Buenas tardes para ti, para todos nuestros panelistas y nuestros participantes. Antes que nada, voy a dar instrucciones del tema de la traducción simultánea. Como la sesión será desarrollada integralmente en inglés, tenemos en la parte de abajo de la pantalla un icono que dice interpretación. Allí está la posibilidad de poner la traducción de inglés a español o si alguien habla en español, de español a inglés. Por favor, entonces, usar esa herramienta. For those of you who are listening in English, even though this session will be entirely in English, you have an icon at the bottom of the screen which says interpretation, and you can choose between Spanish or English if you are interested in one. So after giving these instructions, thank you again, Amparo and Francis, for this very important initiative. My name is Cristina Villarreal. I am from Colombia, in South America, and I am part of the Dying for Dignity Foundation in Colombia. It is my real pleasure and my privilege to moderate this amazing panel that we have this afternoon. To all of our participants, I want to give you our most welcome to this dialogue, which is titled Ethical and Legal Perspectives on Euthanasia. Please let us know where are you from by the chat. I have been seeing that we have people from Mexico City, from Veracruz, Puebla, Querétaro, Oaxaca, Nayarit, Hidalgo, Jalisco, but we also have international people. We have people from Costa Rica, from New York, from Spain, and also from my country, Colombia, which I am grateful to say. I sincerely think that our two panelists today are among the best and more prepared people all around the world to talk about the sensitive issues that we are confronting in this dialogue, as Amparo has said. I should also say that for me, this topic connects directly to my deepest interests, since, as probably some of you know, in Colombia, the Constitutional Court decriminalized abortion under some circumstances in 1997, 23 years ago. Since then, the Constitutional Court invited the Congress to regulate, to pass a law in relation to euthanasia, but nothing has happened from the Congress. So the Ministry of Health began 2 or 3 years ago to regulate, to issue a lot of regulations that made possible in Colombia for some people to decide at the end of their life about the possibility of euthanasia and in that way exercise the right to die with dignity. So we all know that this is a sensitive issue. We all know that countries go forth and go backward with these issues, as it happens with all the things that are related to death, so to rights, excuse me. So that's the story from Colombia, and probably our panelists are going to refer to my country as well. Before presenting our wonderful panelists today, I want to explain a little bit about the dynamics of this dialogue. We have 2 hours in total for all the activity. Each one of our panelists would have 25 minutes to present, one after the other. And after that, we will begin our conversation, and then we will open the floor for the participants' questions and comments through the chat. We have no time to let people talk, so we are going to use the chat, and I am going to moderate this question and answer session, and try to use all of your comments and questions. It would help me a lot if you begin doing your questions during the presentations of the panelists, and let me know to whom these questions are addressed. So now we go to our first panelist. In first place, we will have Peter Singer, covering the ethical arguments around euthanasia and assisted dying. Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher educated at the University of Melbourne and the University of Oxford. After teaching in England, the US, and Australia, he has, since 1999, been Ida W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. He is very well known, but he first became well known internationally after the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975. And you must know that in 2011, the magazine Time included this book, Animal Liberation, on its all-time list of the 100 best non-fiction books published in English since the magazine began in 1923. He has written, co-authored, edited, or co-edited more than 50 books. His works have appeared in more than 30 languages. And one of his books, called The Life You Can Save, first published in 2009, led him to found a non-profit organization on the same name. Finally, in 2012, he was made a companion of the Order of Australia, the nation's highest civic honor. So it is my pleasure, my honor to pass you the word, Peter.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be able to be with you virtually on part of this important webinar on dying with dignity. And I want to thank all of those who made it possible, Amparo especially, and Francis as well. And I want to thank you for your kind introduction. This is an important topic, obviously, and one that is receiving increasing attention and increasing support, really, worldwide. So I feel that it's important to make these issues better known and have them more discussed in Mexico and all over the world where we still do not have the legal right to die in the way we choose. Now I'm going to do a small PowerPoint presentation. So I will now share that screen with you, and I will take you through some of the points on that presentation. Let me just do this. Okay, I hope you can all see that now. I want to emphasize that I'm talking about the ethical questions on euthanasia and what is sometimes called medical aid in dying, or sometimes called physician assistance in dying. So that's my focus. That's my expertise, obviously, as a philosopher. And I won't be discussing the legal issues in detail, but I will say a little bit about some of the arrangements that exist in the world already. Just to begin, perhaps a word on this distinction between euthanasia on the one hand and medical aid in dying or medical assistance in dying, physician assistance in dying on the other hand. By euthanasia, I understand the possibility of a physician giving, at the request of the patient, giving a lethal injection to the patient so that the patient wants to die under various possible conditions and restrictions, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Whereas medical aid in dying or physician assistance in dying is used to refer to a legal framework that allows the physician, again on the request of the patient, to prescribe a medication that the patient can take, a drug, with the aim of the patient ending their own life. So not by a lethal, not by an injection, but by essentially writing a prescription. And as we'll see, that's come to be accepted in some countries that have not yet accepted euthanasia in the full sense of the term. But as I said, I want to focus on the ethical arguments, and so let me start by asking a more background question, a basic question, if you like. If we're talking about euthanasia, and euthanasia is killing another person, obviously normally we think that it's wrong to kill another person. That's something that we have laws against and we regard as a very bad thing to do. But this is in what I call, normal circumstances. And let's look at some of the reasons. In fact, I want to look at 4 different reasons why that is normally a very seriously wrong thing to do. Firstly, it violates the victim's autonomy or right to life. So autonomy in the sense of wanting to live our life as we choose, of course, without interfering with others and in accordance with laws. But if somebody kills you when you want to go on living, that is the most serious and obviously permanent violation of your autonomy. And we say that we have a right to life, that's an important right that human beings have. So again, that right is violated. Secondly, most people want to go on living. That's one of the strongest desires that people have. They will do a lot of things to avoid dying. In fact, here, wherever you're in lockdown because of the risk of coronavirus, you're being restricted in other things that you would like to do because you want to go on living, because we assume you want to go on living and you don't want to take the risk of getting the virus, which might kill you. So killing somebody thwarts the desire that people have to go on living. Thirdly, generally most people think of their lives as positive. They think that we all have some bad experiences, but they think that the good experiences, the good things in life outweigh the bad experiences. And so to kill somebody deprives them of everything else that could happen to them, everything good that could happen to them for the rest of their life. And that's a third reason why it's wrong. And fourthly, there's the impact that it has on others. It's not only the victim for whom there is a wrong. Killing somebody is also a very serious wrong to those who love that person and care for that person and will grieve because of that person's death. So those are 4 important reasons. Maybe it's not a comprehensive list, but I think they're the most important reasons why we think that it is normally wrong to kill another person. Now, we need to ask then, well, are these reasons against allowing voluntary euthanasia or physician assistance in dying? And these are the questions that we can ask about that, which I think suggest that, in fact, for each of these reasons, when we examine them, the reason does not apply in the case of somebody who is terminally or incurably ill or with very little prospect of recovery, and who wants to die, who has a considered request to end their life. So firstly, does the person killed want to go on living? Well, obviously, if they have made a considered request, and I will talk about what it means to say a considered request in this context, if that person does make a considered request for assistance in dying, then that person doesn't want to go on living. So the desire to continue to live is not a reason in this particular case why killing is wrong. Secondly, does the killing deprive the person killed of positive experiences? Well, if the person is terminally ill or incurably ill and has judged that the quality of their life has fallen below the level that they consider positive, so they view the prospect of continuing to live negatively, then it's not going to deprive the person of positive experiences, at least not in their judgment. And I think we should say, who is in a better position to judge whether your life will or will not have positive experiences than the person themselves when they are fully informed and thinking clearly about the prospects for their future. So if the person makes that judgment, I think we should assume that they are the best person to judge that the end of their life will not deprive them of positive experiences. Does the killing increase the grief of loved ones? Well, of course, it's true here that the killing will bring forward that grief. But in the case of somebody who's terminally ill, that grief will occur within a relatively short period anyway. And if people really love somebody, they care for them, and they do not want them to suffer. So if they know that that person is suffering and that that person wants to die, they will, despite the fact that they will grieve when the person is no longer there, they will not wish for their grief to prolong, or for the idea of postponing their grief to prolong the suffering of the person they love. So I don't believe that in this case either, this is a reason against killing. And finally, the reason that I started with in talking about the reasons, obviously, if somebody makes a considered request for the end of their life, it is not violating their autonomy to end their life. In fact, it is violating their autonomy to refuse to assist them, or for the law to refuse to assist them to end their life. So insofar as we think that autonomy is important, then it's an argument in favor of voluntary euthanasia or assistance in dying, not against it. And in terms of talking about a right to life, I think that rights are things that we have that protect us in things we want to do, but they are also things that we can give up, just as a right to property, for example, whatever item of property you might have, that's your right to keep, let's say, if you've legitimately obtained that. But if you decide you no longer want it and you want to give it to somebody else, that's also your right. It doesn't violate your right to property. Let's say you own a nice car, but you decide there's somebody you want to give this car to who could use it better than you. It's not a violation of your right to property for that person to accept your considered gift of the car. So rights are things that we can choose to have, and normally, of course, we do. But if we decide we no longer wish to have our life, then I think we can give up our right to life. So it's not a violation of our right to life for somebody to assist us in dying. Now, if these are the sort of basic ethical questions about killing and they don't apply to euthanasia, then you might ask, well, then why do people think euthanasia is wrong? What is the main reason? And in my experience, the main argument against euthanasia that people put up is what is sometimes called the slippery slope argument. The idea that if we start allowing physicians to kill patients or to assist patients in dying, that will lead us onto a slope that we will slide down. And in some of these cruder forms of the argument, the idea is that there will then be no respect for life, and we will end up with some kind of situation like that of the Nazis, perhaps, where millions of people were killed because they were of a race that the Nazi regime regarded as undesirable, or because they were homosexuals, or because they were Roma, all sorts of reasons. And when I first became involved in this issue about euthanasia, which is going back a long time now, in the 1970s, this was a powerful argument that, although I never thought that it was really likely, I have to admit that I could not really show with evidence that it was false, because at that time we did not have legalized euthanasia or assistance in dying. But that is no longer the case. We now do have legal both voluntary euthanasia and assistance in dying. So voluntary euthanasia, in the full sense, doctors being allowed on request to give a patient a lethal injection. We have in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Luxembourg, and as you heard in the introduction from Cristina Villarreal, in Colombia as well, the only country at this stage outside Europe that allows voluntary euthanasia. But we also have physician assistance in dying, or sometimes it's called physician-assisted suicide, in a number of other jurisdictions, in Switzerland, in Canada, in many states, an increasing number of states of the United States of America, beginning in Oregon more than 20 years ago, in the state of Washington, Montana, Vermont, California, the largest of these states, of course, Colorado, Hawaii, quite recently in New Jersey, where Princeton is situated, and in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., in other words. And relatively recently, physician assistance in dying was also legalized in Australia in 2 states, Victoria, where I'm speaking from now, my home state where I grew up, and also in Western Australia. So this is certainly something that is increasing, and it seems, at least in those jurisdictions, that it was more politically acceptable to legalize medical assistance in dying, medical aid in dying, rather than doctors giving lethal injections. But in all of these situations now, we have significant experience of what happens when you legalize these procedures. And let's just look at that a little bit. So there are guidelines I'm going to focus on the guidelines here in these 3 states of the United States, which have very similar guidelines, and there are other states that are also similar. And in Australia, when this was legalized in Victoria and Western Australia, somewhat similar guidelines were also brought about. So the requirements are that the patient must be an adult, 18 years or older, a resident of the state, I think that's defined as 6 months residence, capable of making and communicating healthcare decisions, so somebody able to communicate and to speak for themselves, and they must be terminally ill, and a physician, or maybe sometimes 2 physicians, must sign a document that they have less than 6 months to live. That can vary in some other jurisdictions as to whether that is required. In the Netherlands, for example, an incurable illness that the patient finds unbearable is sufficient. You don't have to be terminally ill. Now, I talked about a considered request from the patient. So considered in these states means that you have to make 2 separate oral requests, spoken requests, to the physician at least 15 days apart. It's quite a long time if you're suffering severely. some jurisdictions have a shorter period of time, but generally a delay. You can't simply ask for this and receive it immediately. Also a written request, witnessed, with at least 2 witnesses. And then the physician has to consult with a second physician to confirm the diagnosis and the prognosis, that is, that the patient is terminally ill, and the prescribing physician and the consulting physician just have to determine that the patient is capable, that is, that they're competent to make this decision. And if there is some reason for believing that there may be a psychiatric or psychological disorder, the patient has to be referred for an examination. And the prescribing physician must inform the patient of alternatives like palliative care, comfort care, hospice care, and so on. So the patient makes an informed decision knowing what the choices are. Now, when we look at this, as I say, the state of Oregon has had this legal since 1997. So has there been a big slippery slope? Well, there's been some increase, but it's not a very dramatic increase. The numbers are still quite small over these years. And one thing you notice on this graph, by the way, is that more prescriptions are written than are used. Because for many patients, it's a comfort to know that they have the drug, that they can end their life peacefully when they want to, if things get too bad. But if things don't get too bad, they're happy to continue as long as they can. So that's an additional benefit of the legalization of medical aid in dying. It's interesting if we look at why patients want to die. Again, this is from the Oregon state government report. It's not all about pain. If you look at inadequate pain control or the fear of it, that's at the bottom of this list, 27%. Whereas the loss of autonomy and the decreasing ability to participate in activities that make life enjoyable are both over 90%. Patients could indicate more than one of these reasons, of course, which is why we have these numbers. Loss of dignity is important, dying with dignity, loss of control of bodily functions, burden on others, but mostly the sense of a loss of autonomy and not life ceased to be enjoyable and has become to some extent uncomfortable. Now, some people say that people who are particularly vulnerable, minorities, for example, are going to be pressured to die when you legalize this. That was something that was commonly said. Again, the Oregon statistics show that this is not the case. 97% of those who used the legislation were white, and almost half of them had at least a bachelor's degree from a university, and over 99% had some form of medical insurance. So it wasn't that they couldn't get medical care. 91% even were enrolled in hospice care. Some people put that as an alternative. They said if there was enough hospice care, people wouldn't want to end their lives. This shows that that's not true. Hospice care can't do everything that people want. Let's look at the Netherlands, which actually has the longest experience of not exactly fully legalized, but the open practice of voluntary euthanasia, because it was accepted already in 1990 by the Royal Dutch Medical Association, and doctors were not prosecuted, even if it was not fully legalized until 2002. So in 1990, it was under 2% of deaths. Now, 2016 statistics, 26 years later, it's up to 4% of all deaths. But it's certainly not a kind of a runaway thing that is being used widely, and it's certainly not being extended to people who want to go on living. There's no evidence that anyone who wants to go on living is having their life ended in the Netherlands or Belgium or Luxembourg through the legalization of voluntary euthanasia. And the numbers are actually smaller in most of the other jurisdictions. So in Oregon, it's 1 in 200, 0.5%. In Canada, which more recently legalized medical aid in dying, Last year, it's 2% of all deaths, whereas, as I said, in the Netherlands, it's about 4%, so 1 in every 25 deaths. And I think that's relates to different cultures more than anything else. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen. Back with you. I think I'm essentially made the points that I want to make. I imagine that you will have questions about this, but it seems to me that both the ethical arguments and the experiences of those countries that have legalized voluntary euthanasia or medical aid in dying show that this is something that people want, that gives them death with dignity, and it also very importantly shows that it can be used safely and with appropriate safeguards to avoid abuse. I think that's the experience we have now in many different countries over a long period of time, and therefore I think we can confidently say there is no dangerous slippery slope that occurs from the legalization of these procedures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Very, very interesting as always, and very provocative as always, all of your presentation. And we already have a lot of questions, but I am going to bring them at the end after listening to the second panelist. So I continue inviting our participants to put your questions on the chat, and I will try to bring them to Peter and then to Marichui. So now we will listen to the presentation of María de Jesús Medina Arellano. She authorizes me to call her, as I know that everyone calls her, Marichui. And she will be completing this panel because from Peter, we heard about the ethical aspects, and now we will hear about the legal aspects. So that would give us a complete view. Marichui is a Mexican PhD in bioethics and medical jurisprudence. She is a research professor at the Legal Research Institute in the UNAM in Mexico. She's a member of the National Research System in Mexico, SNI Level 1, in the Mexico's National Council of Science and Technology. Currently, she's the deputy of the College of Bioethics, which is a civil association that gathers scientists and physicians working in the area of bioethics and practical and academic perspectives. From 2017, she's a member of the Mexican Council Board of the National Commission of Bioethics. She's also a member of the Board of Directors of the International Association of Bioethics. And since 2019, she's a member of the Ethics Board of the National Council of Health in Mexico. So, as I said at the beginning, we have wonderful panelists, and this is your turn, Marichui.
Thank you so much, Cristina, for this kind introduction. And it's so difficult for me to talk after Professor Singer. But I am also happy and thankful to Amparo Espinosa, Francis Kisling, who kindly invited me to share some thoughts about the human right, about what I believe there's a human right to die with dignity, as it has been settled down in some constitutional courts. So I'm gonna thank you to all of the audience as well, to have the time to be with us and also share your time and your attention to this topic. This is something wrong with my computer and my program, so sorry about the subtitles you're going to see during the presentation, which actually are, according to what I'm saying, they are never. So please don't mind it. I'm gonna start. Well, Peter has already established what is the difference between different kinds of or ways to be helped die. So euthanasia as assisted dying could be presented in different forms. And I'm not gonna explain that now, but maybe we can discuss further later on. But here I just have an example of the different ways that we have regulated the end of life issues around the world. And Peter has also explained where it has been legalized, the euthanasia. I'm sorry for the sound in the background. This is the time. But we have euthanasia legalized in Canada and Colombia and the American continent. And then we have on the other side in Europe, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So we have physician-assisted suicide legalized in the different states that also Peter mentioned it and explained in detail what are the requirements to get access to that. And also recently in Germany, but we don't have yet a specific regulation in that. I don't know if you can correct me, Peter, but this year it was approved.
Yes, that's right.
And we have Switzerland, we have assisted suicide. That means that there is no medical professional intervention. Yeah. It can be done by people who knows how to help. And then that is the case of Switzerland. And Australia, also Peter has explained how it works. This is easy to see that we have progress in terms of human rights in different parts of the world, but sometimes I think, or I believe that this may be discriminatory. And it has been explored from, by other authors as well. Because some people can exercise their right, the last autonomy choice, but some others no. And how this is possible? Is it not discriminatory? Is it not violate equality in the exercise of rights? It's not a violation of that. So we have examples of how people have suffered and looking for justice, equality at the end of life. And we have this case in Spain when Ramon San Pedro, 50 years old, looked for someone to help him to die, and he did die illegally after 20 years of fighting to die legally. He did end his life assisted, but he didn't know that he didn't success in the court in Spain. So he used to say that living is a right, not an obligation. So let's explore why he used to say that. What do you think? Is we are not obliged to live the life that we don't want anymore? If so, medically assisted death should be permitted. And I will also say that it's legally justifiable. But let's think about some questions that we may think before we start thinking about legalization. Do concerns about the impact on vulnerable people justify the provision? So Peter explained about this slippery slope arguments. So these arguments are enough to justify any provision? If we try to pass law that allow physician-assisted suicide or assisted suicide, who should be allowed to have it and who should decide? And let's think about not only people who is terminally ill, let's think about people who may not want to, who have a complete life. So we need to think as well about how can we decide that if we want to prevent any concern of coercions. So how could we safeguard people who might be vulnerable in the different countries? About Mexico, let's think about the huge gap that we have in terms of economic, socioeconomic factors. Let's think about social determinants of health as well. But do not forget that if no one is permitted, it doesn't follow, or does it, that no one is vulnerable. So we need to think that if we make it legal, there are many people living as well with disabilities thinking about the vulnerable, experiencing serious restrictions that they may not want to live anymore in that condition. And let's think about, and I am very grateful, I need to say it, to Frances Kisling, because these are some thoughts that I include after being writing with her. So let's not only think about those people suffering from illness that cannot be treated. Let's think about all of the people that can also be vulnerable because they don't have the legal option. So, do we have a human right to die with dignity? Let's consider some rights. And I like what Peter said before. Some rights we can give up, but some others maybe we would love to exercise and have also the choice to give up or not. The right to life does not imply that there is an obligation to live a life that we don't want to live. The right to life with dignity and liberty, at least in Mexico City, in our constitution is recognized, and it implies autonomy and the right to choose. And I will explain this in detail in the following slides. The right to life with dignity as well could prevail up until reaching the dignified death, up until we say that there is no anymore dignified life. So deciding over our death is an important issue. And it's also an essential element to private life. So we may argue that the state should not intervene in that desire about the rights and liberties when we can exercise. Obviously, it is complicated when we cannot express our wishes regarding our rights. So there are many arguments in favor and against against the legalization, of the euthanasia. And here I have 2 columns. I have saved most of them. So, but there is something that is protected also, not only in the Mexico City Constitution, but also in the Federal Constitution in Mexico. So we have the right to decide with liberty and dignity about our rights. And that is established in the last paragraph of Article 1st in the Constitution. And I must say that because there are many bioethicists and biolaw researchers in Mexico that may not interpret this right in the Article 1st in the same way. And most of the arguments that we have are that the sanctity of life, the right to sanctity of life, is superior to any other right. So there is a life that you cannot dispose of, and it's also protected by the Constitution. But there is no constitutional text that literally say that. So we have other arguments that explain that also to say that there is a medical obligation to provide assistance to end life is against the personal conscience of the medical profession. So the physicians are not obligated. And in Spain, for example, we just had a last report from the Bioethics Commission saying these exact arguments, and I have here the link if you want to check out. But let's explore what is said in the Constitution, and not only in the Constitution, but in the Latin American Convention of Human Rights. We have Article 11, the right to privacy, and it does protect everyone's dignity and the right to do not interference from anyone to your rights. No one may be the object of arbitrary or abusive interference with private life. So it does imply that protect the end of life choices should be something that the state will guarantee. But however, we also recognize that the provision that some states have justify the interests of vulnerable people that cannot consent. And it has been explained for the elderly people in IBE against Bolivia in 2018. But it can also be explained, or we can also ask the question about this right. Could that mean that we can assist someone to die because of compassion? They are already determined to die and will almost certainly do it. And maybe they don't want to fail. So could we be compassionate enough to help? And maybe we do not face prosecution because it's part of the private life of people.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is no positive obligation, obviously, from this reading to facilitate medical assisted suicide. In Colombia, what happened? I have this cartoon from Matador, the son of this person, Ovidio Gonzalez. Cristina, you could correct me if I am not saying the name of this person, who was an activist in defending his right to die with dignity. This was not the first case in Colombia to legalize euthanasia. Obviously, we had the first case in 1997, as Christine explained at the beginning of this talk, of this dialogue. And we have also in Colombia, as in the Mexican Constitution, the protection of human rights and dignity as foundation of all the rights. So the Supreme Court of Justice in Colombia recognized that right as part of the autonomy and liberty of people. So the end of life choices are part of those human rights that must be protected, and the state should not intervene. However, when Ovidio requested to die with dignity, he was not able to do so because from that moment, up until that moment, no law has been passed about the guidelines about how the medical professionals should perform this help. So what they did was an intensive activism on the newsletter. Also, you have this cartoon from his son, El Matador, criticizing why the medical profession, well, the Ministry of Health will not provide this help, even though it was a constitutional right. So after this intense activism, he finally was helped to die, and he had a dignified death. There is a recognition of the importance of healthcare professionals' solidarity towards patients. And that's an important aspect to take into consideration. So what is the legal scenario in Mexico? So we have also this right to privacy and personal integrity, the right to die with dignity, at least in the Mexican Constitution, the federal Constitution, it is established, recently passed last year, 2019. And I have this, the City of Freedom of Rights that was established in the Mexican Constitution, in Mexico City, sorry. So the dignified life contains implicitly the right to a dignified death. However, many of the arguments coming from the society, most of the arguments against this specific right established in the Mexican City Constitution said, well, the dignified death just includes palliative care. That is to say that is to have a dignified death. So many people don't mind to ask people what they believe could be a dignified death. So we need also to ask or to think about the different ways to have a dignified death. So the right to die with dignity does not mean the same for everyone. And the Constitution has protected at least that ambiguity that must be protected by the state and do not interfere with that private choice. However, on the side of the healthcare professional, we have this Hippocratic code that the medical profession still serve about the obligation to preserve life by all means. So still we have a criminal sanction if euthanasia and physical suicide is performed by the Federal Criminal Code and also the General Health Law. We have this article about the physician consensus objection that prevents anyone to help someone to die. And that is something that we have to discuss as well, because there is no regulation about this article in the General Health Law. So we don't even know what is that conscience of the medical professional. So should we get a public registry about what is the conscience of the healthcare professionals working for the public sector, since the state has the obligation to do not interfere to our private life and private choices and a right to a dignified death. So we need to know where the state can protect our rights. So if we want to defend both rights, we have to get clarity about where and why this conscience is not allowing people to exercise that right. And in that sense, from a human rights perspective, we know that our human rights are indivisible and interdependent. So we need the right to healthcare access that is linked to the liberty, private life, integrity that will help us to exercise the right to die with dignity. And it should be respected and is part of the progressive achievement of human rights. However, we must recognize that there are many challenges. The trust to healthcare professionals, it's something that really takes our attention. And in terms of that, we don't want physicians performing euthanasia in a private setting because of their personal relation that they have with a friend, and they cannot do it in the public sector. So we need to trust what physicians or the medical personnel are doing in the private and the public, most of all in the public atmosphere. Because best interests must respect the patient's wishes in private access to healthcare and also public. Most important, in the public sphere, we know that we have also a problem about social determinants of health. So people in vulnerable situations should be considered, and we should consider why we believe that some people can exercise this right. Or can we think like that? Also, we must recognize that the religious group loving public policy makers are so important, also controlling the narrative, because the right to die with dignity, it is not limited to palliative care. To think that way is just wrong, and maybe we can discuss further this point here, I don't know. So there is a research going on as well. We are conducting this research with medical doctors in Guadalajara. I would like to recognize the support from Isaac Gonzalez, who helped me to prepare this, because he has conducted several interviews with medical doctors working in the public sector about the knowledge that I have about these human rights, private life, autonomy, liberty that is established in our Mexican Constitution, the federal one. And we found out that they don't have an idea about these human rights established in the Constitution. Most of them. So we will be sharing this information with you, obviously, with the privacy we need to keep as well. But it's a very interesting point just to take into consideration. So we need empowerment on human rights, not only for the society, but also for the medical professionals. Thank you so much for your attention. And I invite you to follow our activities in the Legal Research Institute. We have many wonderful speakers, as Francis Kisling opened this year diploma on bioethics, and hopefully next year she will accept as well. So thank you so much. Gracias. I hope I was on time, Cristina.
No, it was perfect. Thank you, Marichuy. Very good with time and very good with contents as well. You have a lot of congratulations in the chat from many people. And thank you for sharing this very comprehensive information. I think I would like to see if Amparo has a question. I really promise to do my best with the questions. There are a lot of questions, a lot of controversy here, and we don't have so much time. But Amparo, do you have any question for any one of our panelists? I think we need, in the first place, to define, to use a lot of definitions because of the questions that I am seeing. But if you have any question first, please go on. You're muted. You're muted.
I have many questions, of course, but I rather all the people that are attending our webinar have the chance to pose their own questions, and I will put them later. So thank you. Go ahead.
Okay.
You choose it. You are very good.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, from the questions I'm seeing in the chat, I think that probably both of you, or if you want to split the words between you, but we have a lot of questions regarding the differences between euthanasia and assisted dying, assisted suicide, medical assisted suicide, orthothanasia, passive euthanasia, advanced directives. There's a lot of, I think that there are people who are confused between all those terms. So I don't know, Peter, if you want to begin trying to define some of them, probably tell us the differences between euthanasia and assisted dying and medical assisted dying, probably those three, and orthothanasia, if you want.
So I think by euthanasia, I understand the legislation that exists in the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg and also Colombia. That is that a doctor may, on the patient's request, give the patient an injection that means the patient will fall asleep and not wake up. So it's the doctor's actual, it's the act, it's the doctor's act to end the patient's life. In the case of physician-assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide or medical aid in dying, and I think all of those are exactly the same. They're just different words being used. The physician can write a prescription for a drug that the patient can take, but it must be the patient who takes the drug. The physician does not administer the drug to the patient. It's a fine distinction. I think some people think that it's somehow safer against abuses because the doctor can't actually do it. The patient has to do it. So it's like the patient's final decision to do it. I don't myself see that there's much difference. And one disadvantage is that some patients, when they're terminally ill, may be unable to swallow a drug. They may, for example, have cancer of the esophagus, so nothing they swallow will be possible. They'll just vomit it up again. and in that case, then physician aid in dying or medical aid in dying doesn't help the patient. So that's a disadvantage with that. Now, one other thing is that I actually made a little mistake about in what I said, and Marie Chui picked it up, is that I said that I included Switzerland as having physician aid in dying or medical aid in dying. And strictly, she's right that you don't have to be a doctor. You don't have to have a medical qualification to assist someone in dying in Switzerland. So it should be just described as assisted dying or assisted suicide, rather than physician-assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide.
Okay. And do you find that assisted suicide without the medical or the doctor or the physician being part of it is part of this discussion?
Well, it can be. It can be. And in Switzerland, there seems to be a culture that has developed that this is accepted and it works. And I'm not aware of cases of abuses. There are professional associations which help people to die. But it's not been adopted anywhere else, to the best of my knowledge, and I don't particularly recommend it. I think having a requirement that there be professional medical assistance on hand is probably an additional safeguard that in most other countries would be useful.
Okay, and what about passive and active euthanasia? As you know, this has been like a long history of discussion about that, and do you think that it makes sense to have this distinction?
Well, you can draw the distinction by passive euthanasia is generally regarded as non-treatment or withdrawal of treatment. So this is actually very common, and this is legal pretty much everywhere, to the best of my knowledge, that if a patient is terminally ill, you can, let's say they're on a respirator that's keeping them alive, you can withdraw the respirator. Now, I think that should be also with the patient's consent if the patient is competent, or if not, with the consent of the family if the patient is not competent. And I think it's essentially ethically equivalent. You're bringing about the death of the patient. You know that the patient can't live without the respirator, so you turn off the respirator. It's the same as giving the patient a lethal injection, really. The patient ends up dead. But it's more widely accepted, and so this is, people think that there is an ethical distinction between actively ending someone's life and doing it passively, but I don't agree with that view. I think that ethically they're really equivalent, and it's a kind of a paradox, really, that physicians are allowed and accept the withdrawal of treatment, knowing that that will end the patient's life, but they're not prepared to take active steps, and in many countries they're not legally permitted to take those active steps.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Marie-Chui, probably it would be nice if you can clarify what are the advanced directives in relation to, if that's the same as euthanasia or not, or assisted dying, because there's a lot of comments in the chat about that. And please unmute.
Yes, thank you, Cristina. Well, that is the main perception in Mexico. I'm not sure. I'm going to talk about what is the perception when I'm talking to healthcare professionals in Mexico. There's the belief that the only way to end life with dignity is by withdrawing treatment, as Peter said, and that is legal. That is not something that we are discussing most of the time. So we have this law about living wills regarding the end of life when you cannot express, you are not anymore competent. So you can decide whether you want to go to intensive care or not, or maybe extraordinary measures. So that is regulated, and it's a way also to a dignified death, yes, but it's not the only one. So the clarification is that, and I am reading, sorry, I am just trying to read all of the messages, because most of the, I believe, people who are writing are thinking about the only way to respect the dignity, the right to die with dignity, but no, it's not the only way.
Okay.
The directives living west in Mexico City, not in all the states, but the main problem about that is legislators in Mexico confusing the concepts. So they have one law that includes palliative care, living wills. They say that this is not euthanasia, this is not assisted dying. Well, first of all, you regulate palliative care, that we need it as well. So you get a separate law and just do not mix up concepts and try to regulate everything in just one bill that is not even applicable, because one action establishing an article contradicts the other one. So it just becomes that letter, we say that. How do you say that, Peter? It becomes something that is not applicable, not efficient, and then it causes so much confusion most of the time with the medical, the healthcare professionals who would like to help someone to have the dignified death that they ask for. So there is this ambiguity that does not help the healthcare professional who would love to help someone to exercise their last and most important rights in exercise of autonomy. I don't know if I am explaining clearly. I don't know, Peter, if you want to add a comment on that. But
no, I think what you said is fine. Yeah.
So it is important, now this is just a message for all of the healthcare professionals who are here with us, to also be empathetic towards those people asking you to help them to exercise their rights. Some of them can do it in a private facility, backyards obviously, but most of them don't, recognizing our public healthcare facilities. So some of you are saying you are following the Hippocratic Code of Conduct for medical profession that say that you should save life at all costs. I don't remember how it's exactly, but someone just quoted here, like the complete paragraph. And also the question was directed to Peter about that. And that is also something that I also understand how you feel. Like this is something that contradicts to what you were trained to do, but it's not. We also must think that rights are universal, but not absolute. Moral obligations as well, but you are obliged to respect the rights of people that you are helping in the public sector. So you have to make a balance. You have also to consider what is the right that should be respected. And maybe this argumentation goes most of the time to courts and not to the ethics committee in hospitals or the ethics training of doctors. And that is something that some of the challenges that I say that we are facing in Mexico.
Okay, so going ahead with that idea, do you think that the right to live implies the obligation to live?
Obviously, I don't. I think in general, rights do not imply obligations. As I said, my right to my property does not imply an obligation to retain my property. I'm entirely within my rights if I decide to give away any particular item of my property, or perhaps all of my property. Perhaps I want to be a pauper and a wandering monk without any possessions or something like that. That's perfectly within my rights. So I don't think there is any obligation to live. Of course, in making such a decision, one should consider others, and one should consider the effect that one's death would have on others. So it's not something to be taken lightly. But particularly where the future is bleak and you are likely to be dying within months and the quality of your life is bad and you're not likely to improve, I don't think you have an obligation then to continue to live at all.
Okay. Marichui, you mentioned the palliative care, and there's a discussion, and in the first webinar of these dialogues we discussed if you think that we should oppose palliative care versus euthanasia or assisted dying, or they are part of the same right to die with dignity. How do you?
Well, it's not. I'm not going to give a lecture on constitutional interpretational rights, but there is no an explicit list of ways to die with dignity, at least in the Constitution. But the Constitution clearly states that there is a right to die with dignity. That includes palliative care, but it's not limited to. So even though if secondary legislation has a provision, imagine the healthcare law, we can contest that. It can be constitutionally contested. It is ethically contested already. And it's also constitutionally contested. But at least it is, sometimes we thought that it's just discriminatory, that not all people can go to a court to exercise their right that is protected in the Constitution. So yes, there is a need to judicialize that right in order to get to the court, as it happens in Colombia, for example. So I just got the reading from someone from the National Society of Palliative Care, Mónica Ocio. Saludos. So she said that in Mexico, medical doctors cannot give treatment or medicines to patients, and they are obliged to give attention, palliative attention. Of course, they are obliged to give palliative care, but they are not. No, well, Monica, there's not the only way to help someone to die. So, and we are not trying to say that palliative care is not important. It's really important in your country. And we also need to argue why it is. But we also need to say that this is not the only way to have a dignified death.
Okay, thank you both. We have some questions, one coming from Rafael Galindo and another one from Maria Jose Macias, to you, Peter, in relation to those patients with, for example, Alzheimer's disease, and other question is if euthanasia only applies to medical conditions, what happens to those who cannot declare their will because they didn't do it in advance, but now they're suffering from all those diseases. So what do you think about that issues?
Well, I've taken today's topic as being about voluntary euthanasia or voluntary dying. And so I've not considered patients who are not competent. As I showed in my presentation, the legislation in the countries that I've been talking about requires the patient to be competent. There is, of course, a separate question about patients who have advanced dementia or perhaps who are in a persistent vegetative state and did not give any advance instructions. Those questions are being discussed in various jurisdictions. So one remedy, of course, is, as Marichui has mentioned, advance declarations. But normally you can only give an advance declaration against being treated. So you can say, if I am demented and I become ill, I do not want any treatment. You know, I don't want antibiotics, for example, if I get pneumonia. And that quite often happens in aged care facilities where patients are severely demented, that if they get pneumonia, they are not given even the simplest of treatment because it's recognized that the quality of their life has declined to a point where they would not go on living, and usually the family do not see any point in that either. Now, I think if we were to consider this properly, then we should say people should be able to make advance declarations that if they get to a certain point with dementia, let's say, they do not want to live at all. You know, you don't have to wait for them to get pneumonia, that you can end their lives. But although that's being discussed in the Netherlands and in Belgium, I think, it's not something that is part of the legal regimes that we're talking about here. And I think it's a somewhat more complicated question. It's easier to say yes when people are competent and they express their will. We should act on their will. Personally, I would not oppose legislation that allowed you to make advance declarations that you should be killed. You know, if, for example, you no longer recognize your children, you don't know who they are, you don't know anything about what's going on, I would personally think that I would not want to go on living past that point. That would not be a dignified way of living for me. But you know, clearly that kind of legislation where people are making decisions for others raises different issues, and maybe there's more worries about this kind of slippery slope that, as I say, I don't think really has been shown to exist in the case of patients who are fully competent. So that's why I consider these to be different decisions. In the case of somebody who's in a persistent vegetative state and therefore needs a feeding tube in order to obtain nourishment, if the doctors are clear that there is no prospect of recovery, and sometimes, especially because of our brain imaging techniques, we can be completely certain of that, I would think that it's appropriate to withdraw the feeding tube in those cases, and then the patient will die quite soon.
Okay. Does that mean that you put any limits on the right to euthanasia or assisted dying?
Well, I put no limits on the right of a competent patient for euthanasia or assisted dying. And as I said, it's not that I think that there isn't an ethical justification for saying if I reach a certain stage of dementia, I should be assisted to die. I just think that there are public policy concerns about how you implement that legally. And I also think this is maybe more a political sense, that in terms of organizations arguing in countries like Mexico, where there is no legal euthanasia or medical assistance in dying, I think it's a mistake to bring in the cases of dementia where patients are not competent. I think that causes more alarm and more concern, and you're more likely to get the legislation that will deal with the majority of cases if you restrict it to competent patients.
Okay, thank you. Marichuy, there are some questions from the public. Alejandro Rodriguez made a question, and I myself also have the same question. It is, why do you think that this right is seen so negatively? And why do you think that the congresses of our countries are not passing laws in relation to this issue? If we consider, for instance, for Mexico, from the survey that DMD Mexico made, I saw that the results say that 68% of Mexicans agree with euthanasia, and 71% think that the laws should change. So what happened? What's happening? Why it is so negatively seen? You have to unmute.
That's a very tough question. I don't think that I have the answer either.
Do you prefer to answer in Spanish, since Lilia can translate you?
Sí, tampoco tengo la respuesta. Sin embargo, tengo la experiencia de hablar con legisladores locales en México y tenemos que ver en esta encuesta a quién se entrevistó, a quiénes. Porque la renuencia que hay de legisladores locales que en lo privado reconocen que en lo privado, en conversaciones, reconocen que hay un derecho a morir con dignidad, no lo reconocen en la esfera pública ni tampoco lo legislarían porque perderían votos. Entonces, sería muy interesante conocer por qué las personas en lo privado contestan sus deseos y en lo público temen expresar que el reconocimiento de que las personas tengan este derecho a morir con dignidad. Entonces es algo que también a mí me intriga y realmente tiene que ver con el hecho de la sacralidad de la vida y lo conectado que está el tema precisamente con cuestiones del inicio de la vida para recabar votos políticos y por eso creo que sí tenemos que tomar en cuenta los determinantes sociales en salud para entender mejor estas posiciones que tenemos en lo privado y en lo público. Entonces, no tengo la respuesta, pero sí creo que diálogos como el que tenemos hoy nos ayuda a pensar mejor y a poder expresarnos públicamente sin ningún temor al prejuicio que ocurre en el ejercicio de muchos otros derechos. Por ejemplo, el deseo de interrumpir un embarazo no deseado, por ejemplo. ¿Sí? Entonces, también es algo que causa mi atención. And I just would like to ask a question for Peter, if may I?
Sure.
Can I write as panelist? So, we haven't talked, Peter, and I know that in Mexico we're still afraid of talking about this publicly, and Amparo said at the beginning, I liked what she said. We celebrated the Day of the Dead, we talk, but we laugh about it, and I mean, we talk in not serious terms. So if we're talking seriously about that, we may face a stigma, prejudices because of the sanctity of life, and that. And it just, for me, I feel a little bit frustrated because I have seen children suffering. And they don't, sometimes, maybe they don't have the same value of life as their parents. And I know that you said before, yes, we're talking about this, let's talk about capacity. But it is also difficult to recognize that children have capacity to take decisions over their life and that. So how we address this point about seriously ill children, and I also got this reflection from Francis that would like to end up painful treatment against their parents' wishes. And and sometimes I have heard many Mexican mothers saying, no, my baby from the very beginning, 1 month, years old, and he knew what he wanted. But when they say 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, what they want, they are not listened. So how do we talk about this, about this right, if we believe there is a right? It's just for legal age people. What about children in these situations not wanted to complete treatment and to have a dignified death?
Well, it's a separate question, of course, at what age we should think that people are capable of making those decisions. Again, the Netherlands and Belgium have had more discussion on this than any other countries, to my knowledge. And Belgium does allow children to, Belgium allows children to request euthanasia, and there is, I think, below a certain age, they must also have the consent of their parents, and above that age, they don't need the consent of their parents. And I don't remember now exactly what that age is, but certainly at some, they don't have to be 18. They don't have to be fully adult anyway to be able to make that decision. But obviously, very young children might be in pain and uncomfortable, but they don't have a perspective on how long this will last. And so I'm not in favor of saying that any child capable of saying, I want to die, should have the right to die. I do think that you need a certain maturity and level of understanding. And before that, your parents normally would be the best people to make that decision for you. Sometimes, for various reasons, the courts may appoint a guardian of the child. That may be useful as well. So I do think these decisions need to be made. And of course, they are being made in the case of decisions to give or to withdraw life support. That happens at the very earliest stage. Parents can say to doctors, if they have a child born with a very serious disability, they can say, I don't want you to put my baby on a respirator. And usually doctors will agree with that. Not always, but sometimes even the suggestion comes from the doctors. They say, look, your child is not going to be able to really live very long, or maybe they'll say your child will live, but your child will never be responsive, will never even smile at you. You will just lie there on a bed and you will have to feed the child. And then the parents, and do you want us to put this child on a respirator? And the parents nearly always then will say, no, please don't do that. So yes, those decisions get made in the case of withdrawal of treatment. And similarly, I think they have to be made sometimes where the child is suffering or in pain and has poor prospects of long-term survival. But they're difficult, and I think it's very difficult to have a sort of general rule or policy at a particular age that a child can make this decision, and before that age they cannot.
Okay. I think Amparo has a comment to share with us.
Yo quería comentar algo respecto de lo que dijo Marichuy de la encuesta. Fue una encuesta representativa a nivel nacional, presencial. Fue en el 2016. Entonces fueron personas de arriba de 18 años, hombres y mujeres. Me parece que fue hasta los 90 años, o sea, de todas las edades. Y la tenemos por estados, por sexo, por profesiones. Y bueno, en los estados, en el sureste, por ejemplo, la aprobación de la eutanasia fue menor, pero en ningún estado fue abajo del 50%. En todos los estados del país había opiniones a favor de la eutanasia más allá del 50%. El promedio, ya lo mencionó alguno de los panelistas, fue alrededor del 74-75%. El promedio de aceptación de la eutanasia, de que se legalizara la eutanasia. Y fueron preguntas hechas de distinta manera. Por ejemplo, si un familiar tuyo estuviera enfermo, ¿te gustaría? ¿Lo aceptarías? Si tú estuvieras enfermo, fueron puestas de distinta manera y invariablemente la respuesta fue favorable para la eutanasia. Y curiosamente, yo habría esperado lo contrario, pero fue más favorable para la eutanasia que para el suicidio médicamente asistido. O sea, no había mucha diferencia, pero digamos unos 4 o 5 puntos de diferencia. Preferían legalizar la eutanasia o ellos morir por eutanasia que por suicidio médicamente asistido. Otro lado que me pareció curioso es que las personas mayores estaban menos a favor de la eutanasia que las personas jóvenes. Yo habría esperado también lo contrario. Y alguien aquí me parece que mencionaba el tema de la religión. También lo tenemos por religiones. Y los católicos también aceptaban la eutanasia en muy alto porcentaje, mucho más que las personas judías. O sea, en la población en general, los católicos, por lo menos en el 2016, creo que me gustaría que hiciéramos una nueva encuesta el año próximo después del coronavirus, porque hemos hecho otras acerca de los cuidados paliativos y demás, y creo que podremos hacer otra con distintas preguntas, pero sí, respondiéndole a Marichuy, fue hecha así, la entrevista fue presencial, te digo, y en todo el país, representativa con un margen de error de 2,5% o 3%, y como tú dices, es difícil de entender que no se legalice, pero siento que es un tema muy delicado, las personas, las altas jerarquías de todos lados, es un tema que tocan con mucho cuidado. Bueno, eso era todo mi comentario. Gracias, Cristi.
Gracias, Amparo, coincido contigo. Es un tipo, no, bueno, no, coincido contigo.
Okay. Amparo, could you please put the link of the survey in the chat, because there are people who are asking for it, so for all the participants, please.
Claro.
I have a question that I love, that question for Peter. This is from Harvey Berman, who says that considering that most of the dissidents in Oregon are white, affluent, educated, does that not suggest a social class disparity in who accesses or exercises the rights to assisted dying?
I don't think it suggests or shows a disparity in who has access to assisted dying. I think Oregonians in general have access to assisted dying if they have access to a doctor at all. And, you know, although the healthcare system in the United States is not good and is not as good as it should be, let's be clear, everybody in the United States who is in danger of dying can go to the emergency room of a hospital and must be treated. People in the United States cannot get turned away if they're in danger of dying by a hospital emergency room. So everybody in Oregon has access to some level of medical care if they are in danger of dying. And they also then have access to this legislation. I don't think that the problem is that they don't have access to it. I think the issue is more that they are not choosing to use it to the same extent. I'm not sure why that is. Again, there can be cultural differences, perhaps, as to who wishes to use it, who chooses to use it. To some extent, it may be that people who are less well educated are less informed about it. That's also possible. But I think it's probably more likely that they think that they ought not to use it. Perhaps that they are more likely to have religious beliefs that prevent them from making use of it. I don't believe that it's a case of lack of access.
Okay, Francis, do you want?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on this. I think that the reasons are probably fairly complex, and I don't totally agree with Peter, although he's, mostly he's trying to think about the possibilities, not saying something definitive about this. In general, we find in the health system that African Americans in particular are highly suspicious of the healthcare system. And there is a much higher level of fear. For example, we see this in studies on organ transplantation. Many African Americans, more African Americans say, I am afraid the doctors are going to kill me. They are going to take my organs because I am Black. And I think, obviously it's a stretch in my thinking, but I think that the level of confidence between minority people and the health system is very low. And taking advantage of something like death, by physician-assisted death or even euthanasia, requires a certain amount of confidence in the system. And so I think there are multiple reasons, but I would not rule out the question of confidence. On the other hand, I think another reason can be disparities in healthcare in the United States. There's a much higher percentage of white educated people, that 97% who are relying on this, who probably have a personal physician and access to to certain services that while you can go to the emergency room and get cared for, poorer people often are relying on the public system. And the public system excludes, in most instances, the possibility for the kind of relationship in which a patient and the patient's family and the doctors would have the kind of discussions that need to go on to effectuate using the law. So I think we have to put those in as well.
Okay,
Thanks, Francis. I'm sure that does supplement what I'm saying, and you have a deeper knowledge of the US healthcare system than I do.
Okay.
And I have a private doctor.
We have a question that I am going to read it in Spanish since I'm not sure I can translate it adequately. So Lilia, please help me. It's for Peter again, and it says, filosófica y éticamente es coherente afirmar que hay un derecho a morir con dignidad, cuando al mismo tiempo sabemos que desde el punto de vista de la ética deontológica, la autonomía no es libertad para elegir, sino autolegislación, es decir, constreñimiento para actuar. Entonces, ¿cuál debería ser el contenido de la autonomía en los casos de eutanasia?
So I'm not totally sure that I've understood, I understand the words of the question, but I'm not sure that I understand the problem that is motivating the question here. I regard autonomy as the ability to make decisions for ourselves about how we want to live. And of course, how we want to die is part of how we want to live. So I think that to be able to make those decisions is what autonomy is. And I think if we value autonomy, then we should try to extend people's autonomy over the important decisions in their life. And therefore, I think autonomy leads to the idea that people should have the choices that the legislation that we've been talking about would make possible. I'm not sure if there's something that I've failed to understand in the questioner sees a different kind of problem, but that's the way that I see the issue.
So Peter, if I might add to that, it is like a confusion about self-determination and choices. So I believe so. I don't know, Laura, you correct me, but it seems to me that there is no clear understanding about autonomy, if it is self-governance, self-determination, or just the right to choose or to have choices and freely choose to die.
Right. Well, you know, we have choices under constrained circumstances. Clearly, I suppose, you know, most people would, if they could choose to live, they would live. But if they know that they have, let's say, a cancer that the doctors tell them is incurable, and they know that they will die within 3 months, let's say, or 6 months, or whatever it might be, and they are in pain and discomfort, then autonomy consists in their choosing within those constraints. And I think it's fully consistent with autonomy that they should be able to choose when they are going to die and how they are going to die.
Okay, I think we should move forward to almost to close. So I have a question to Mari-Troy and then to both of you. To Mari-Troy, there are some people who are asking, as Jose Alejandro Barrios, he's asking, which would be the ideal moment to impulse an initiative to legalize euthanasia in Mexico in particular? And someone more says that probably now that you have a liberal and progressive government. So what do you think about that, Mari-Troy?
Cristina, okay, this is very political. We have in place an initiative right now about I don't know, Amparo, if you know about it, but also about including euthanasia as part of the right to die with dignity. I'm not sure if it is going even to be discussed by the legislators, but there is like an initiative coming from this progressive political party ruling. But this is a time where we have a government that has promised to protect the human rights. So let's ask to keep that promise and follow up that initiative about the right to die with dignity. I think that we should follow that and discuss publicly and be invited to have that discussions with the persons taking that political decisions. I'm humble about it because I'm not a politician, but I am activist. Yes, I am an academic activist about this, so I'm going to be following. So if you want to follow with me, you are welcome.
Okay, and the last question for both of us before Amparo gives us our closing remarks is what do you think that the role of DMD in Mexico should be different from what they are already doing to advance in the right for dying with dignity?
Well, if you're asking me, obviously, I don't know the situation in Mexico well enough, and I think probably I'm not the right person to offer DMD advice on what they should be doing. The only thing, consistent with what I've been saying and what I see in the United States is that it is medical aid in dying that seems to be more acceptable. Now, whether that's true in Mexico, I don't know. In Colombia, I understand that it's not. Voluntary euthanasia is acceptable, and if in that respect, if Mexico is like Colombia, then that is what DMD should support. On the other hand, if I know also there was a lot of communication, for example, between Mexicans and Californians. People go back and forth. Maybe Trump has made it a bit harder, but it's not entirely stopped, obviously. So maybe people in Mexico would be reassured if DMD said, look, you could have the same laws as California. And they've worked in California now for some time. Californians support them. There's no problem there. So that would be another possible strategy. But as I say, I'm an outsider, so you shouldn't really listen to me. DMD should make up its own mind about the best strategies to pursue.
Thank you. Marichuy, any comment?
Well, so I think that Amparo could lead us as well on this, but Colombia and Mexico, we are so close, and also California, but I don't believe that we have the same discussion publicly. So that is why I insist that this is a very important forum to keep on discussing, having this dialogue, and please don't interpret my words wrongly. This is a time keeping your health as well. I don't want you to go to the streets and put your life in risk, but we have to keep this dialogue. We have to get connected and keep on working on strategies, and also to just being empathic and being more understanding the situations of all people, and we can continue doing this by online. And I don't know, Amparo could invite us more to this public dialogue, and also to not be afraid to bring to the front these topics and what we want and what we think about it as a right.
Okay, thank you to both of our panelists for this very, very interesting dialogue. You helped us to understand the different perspectives, and I should apologize with our participants. Thank you in the first place, because they were very, very participative. They made a lot of comments, questions, and I should apologize because we couldn't have time to answer and to read all the questions we had and the comments. So Amparo, I think you need another dialogue on euthanasia. So please, I pass the word to you, to your closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Here it is. Bueno, nosotros vamos a seguir con estos diálogos. Están siendo muy concurridos. Quiere decir que hay mucha necesidad de intercambiar opiniones, de intercambiar ideas, de escuchar. O sea, creo que Francis tuvo esta magnífica idea junto conmigo y vamos a seguir y vamos a agradecer las sugerencias que tengan de distintos temas, de distintos enfoques, lo que ustedes nos puedan decir, porque llegó muchísima gente, Peter, a lot of people, Peter, mucha gente, mucha más de la que pensamos, realmente, o sea que fue muy exitoso y sí les quiero agradecer, bueno, para empezar a agradecer a Peter desde Melbourne, Marichuy, muchas gracias, Cristina, es un trabajo fantástico, de verdad, muchas gracias, a Lilia también, bueno, Francis, desde luego Rodrigo, que es nuestro technician, que está haciendo una labor realmente muy buena, a todo el equipo de DMD, que también está trabajando muchísimo, y invitarlos a todos, y creo que Peter es como un promotor de esto, que desarrollen sus propias ideas, o sea, que escuchen y que con esto vayan realmente pensando por ustedes mismos, por nosotras, venir con ideas, ver qué es lo que nos convence, qué es lo que queremos hacer y bueno, por nuestra parte seguiremos haciendo encuestas y escuchando para poder promoverlas. Creo que ese es un camino buenísimo, todo el mundo le gustan y escucha las encuestas y es la mejor manera de que las autoridades también vean lo que está pensando la población. Pues muchísimas gracias por estar aquí presentes. Ya les estaremos enviando a todos los asistentes un agradecimiento y además anunciando los próximos diálogos que van a ser realmente muy pronto y yo creo que van a estar muy fascinantes. Muchas gracias a todos. Nos vemos muy pronto. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Gracias.
Bye.
Buenas noches.